So I suppose the first element that we need to examine today or consider today is where we are. Where we are today as a society, where we are today as Christians in America. But before we get there, I'd like to talk briefly about where we were. It's one thing to know where you are, but if you don't know in relation or context to where you've come from, you might miss some key elements. And so the first part that I want to address this morning, I'm calling the malaise of modernity. It's a phrase that philosopher Charles Taylor has used, and I think it fits very well in describing the general feeling of discontentment that we tend to have. And so we're going to address this concern of the malaise of modernity today. But first, where were we? About 500 years ago, let's keep it in the northwestern world. So 500 years ago in Europe, pretty much everyone believed in the transcendent realm. Humans lived their lives in submission to the transcendent. Everything in their world centered around something that was larger than them, something that was more supreme or above all of us, that united us together as a human race, but also superseded even human existence. And Charles Taylor, in talking about this period, notes that for Christians, God does will human flourishing, but thy will be done does not reduce to let humans flourish. So in this period, as people live lives aware of the transcendent, aware that there is something above them, that there is something supernatural, a realm that exists that is beyond what we can grasp with our senses, then we understand from reading Scripture that God does want us as human beings to flourish. He truly does want us to thrive. But thriving as humans, flourishing as a race, is not the end goal of humanity. We have some overarching principle and purpose that supersedes all of this. But as should be readily apparent, this is not our modern social imaginary. By social imaginary, I mean the way the majority of us see and understand the world. You can think of it as the way we construe reality. So if that's where we were 500 years ago, where everyone believed in the transcendent and everyone understood that there were goals that superseded just my own physical material needs, then where are we now? Nowadays, I would suggest that belief in transcendence is the exception and not the rule. It is increasingly difficult to justify any position that gives personal beliefs preeminence over our modern social imaginary. We see this in the way people talk to each other. Well, that's fine for you to believe, but I am going to believe differently. You can have your beliefs, and you can, if you want that crutch of religion, you can depend on that. But those of us who are mature can face the harsh realities of this world, that there is nothing else outside of the material realm. There is no real supernatural creature you call God. And the sooner that you can just grow up and maturely steel yourself against the harsh, cold realities of this universe, the better off you'll be. Charles Taylor mentions in talking about now where we are, he says, a way of putting our present condition, he refers to this as our secular age, is to say that many people are happy living for goals which are purely immanent. They live in a way that takes no account of the transcendent. And this is where we find ourselves today. And what I'm going to suggest as we walk through this message is that none of us are immune to the consequences of living in this age. That while everyone in this room probably would say, yes, I believe in transcendence, of course I believe in God, and of course I live my life in ways that reveal that I truly do believe in God, I would like to suggest that all of us have blind spots at the very least. And so follow with me as we continue through this conversation. Now, it's going to seem obvious to many of you, but what is the problem with life in this modern secular age? And what, if any, are the solutions to escaping this malaise? Part 2 this morning is the consequences of disenchantment. First, we inhabit what Charles Taylor calls an immanent frame. And for the more astute among you, every time I've mentioned this, someone has commented to me that that's not how you spell immanent, and that's not the right word. This is a philosophy word, and Charles Taylor's using it in a very specific context. So I've given this to you as a definition on the back of your notes there. But what he means by the immanent frame is that where the ancients lived lives that were permeated with the supernatural realm, we moderns have closed ourselves off to the possibility of transcendence, inhabiting an immanent frame. We've effectively put ourselves into a box. It has a roof over our heads and 4 walls and a floor, and only what is in the box is. And you can only grasp reality with your actual senses. So if you can't see it, hear it, taste it, touch it, or smell it, it isn't really real. It's something that you may make up yourself, but it doesn't actually exist. Only the material realm really is. This produces, again, what he calls the buffered self. And the buffered self, as a result of the immanent frame, we're no longer affected by the transcendent realm in the way we used to be. So back in the day, they would talk about demonic possession, or angels and demons and spirits and fairies and all of these other, supernatural beings, and they actually have the ability to interact with us and to upon us and to affect us in real and tangible ways. And today we've buffered ourselves off to that. We've closed our minds off and said that meaning is really just in our minds. So objects as themselves don't necessarily hold meaning by themselves. This is really obvious to us when we consider the Roman Catholic practice of indulgences and relics. They believed that the objects themselves actually possessed meaning by themselves. I didn't give it meaning, it just has meaning because it exists in another realm, a transcendent plane. And now, today, we talk more along the lines of, this is what this means to me. This is why this is important to me. This is why this has significance to me. We've buffered ourselves off. We've closed ourselves off to the transcendent realm. In fact, to demonstrate that this has become so pervasive, we use this kind of language when we say somebody is talking about things outside of their mind being able to affect them. We literally say they're talking out of their mind. In the common vernacular, we say they're crazy. It sounds crazy to talk about things outside of you being able to impact you or affect you or manipulate you or transform you in some sort of way. We humans live our lives in such ways that we are the ones who determine our destinies. And it's up to us and our self-effort and our own wills to accomplish and achieve for ourselves our best lives now. This is the world in which we inhabit. So what is the result of this immanent frame and the buffered self? Charles Taylor uses words like haunted, cross-pressured, fragile, and disenchanted to describe the world that we live in. When we have disenchanted the world, and by that I mean removed or drained the world of its transcendent realm, we discover that something is missing. We're not just bodies. We're not just bodies and minds. but we were actually created with souls that were intended to commune and fellowship and interact with the transcendent realm. And so when we cut that off and call ourselves crazy, and don't underestimate just how powerful it is when society encourages or discourages you from talking about the transcendent realm by calling you crazy, don't underestimate the power that that has to shape the way you actually start to think about the world you live in. Have you ever felt awkward talking to someone about spiritual things? You feel awkward because you're worried that they're going to think that you're crazy. And yet we discover that our world is haunted. It's why people flock to movies like Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings, because even though we don't actually believe that stuff is really real, something deep inside of us longs for it to be real. We want it to be true. Julian Barnes, a famous atheist author, put it this way: I don't believe in God, but I miss him. What we end up with in the end is a flattened world, one in which it is increasingly difficult to conceptualize of a supernatural, transcendent realm that is interacting with our immanent, buffered selves. Unless you think this is a problem only for those outside the church, consider the following examples. I want to offer you some proof that immanence is our default setting. And by our, I mean all of us. I mean me. Mike Cosper wrote a book recapturing the wonder, and I'm going to refer to it a couple times in the second part of this message. But he begins his book by recounting a story. He went to his parents' church service. They were dedicating their new $80 million facility. Can you imagine? An $80 million facility. It was amazing, he said. The sanctuary had to be at least 4 stories tall, and behind the platform was a cross, he said, covered most of the distance between the platform and the ceiling. So this cross is probably close to 30 feet tall, and during the dedication service, they had a musician come out and play a special number, and as he begins playing, a light comes on behind the cross. And as he continues to play, the light gets brighter and brighter until he reaches his crescendo in the song. And as Cosper recounts it, the light at that point was migraine-inducing brightness. And then the song ends, and people all over the auditorium stand to their feet, some with tears rolling down their cheeks, and they just applaud. And at lunch after service, Mike was with his parents, and his dad asked him, "So what'd you think?" "What do you mean?" Mike asked. His dad said, "The cross. Did you think that was real?" And Mike says, "Real? You mean like a miracle?" Now, if your reaction is anything like mine, I immediately felt sorry for this old man. Somebody's played a really nasty trick on this guy. Because I know how lighting works, and I know how stage effects work. I know how productions go, and I can promise you, in the dedication service of an $80 million facility, the lighting on the cross in this moment was not left to chance. There was a paid technician sitting in a booth whose only job that day was to hit play on the lighting program right as the song began, and that light was perfectly tuned to increase just in line with the song and reach that crescendo at just the right moment. This is how stage effects work, right? And so this poor old man, wondering if that was a miracle. I pictured him in my mind, that super spiritual old guy that you just love, listening to stories and talking to, but always makes you feel just a little bit uncomfortable because they always make everything spiritual. Turns out this guy's an engineer. He builds runways at airports for a living. Imagine that. Mike Cosper realized something in his own heart as he had this interaction and encounter with his dad. Which is stranger, he writes, to want to read a miracle into a stage effect, or to be a Christian? Level reaction is, that's ridiculous. Why wouldn't God show up in a service like this? Why wouldn't God show up at an $80 million facility built to His glory to honor Him, with the place probably packed out with lots of people who needed an encounter with God? Why wouldn't God show up in a real and powerful way in this service? Now, I'm not telling you either way whether that was a miracle or wasn't a miracle. The point I'm trying to make is, what was your reaction to the story? See, we know how lights work. We know how productions work. Science has left very little room for this kind of mystery anymore. So we don't need God. We don't need God to perform a miracle at that point because we have electricity and we have lighting programs. And so we even tend to push God out of the very services that are intended to honor Him and to celebrate and to live in His presence with us. Here's another example for you. We had a young man in our youth group as we were playing games before youth a few weeks ago. He fell. And about halfway through the message that night, he raised his hand, and I thought he was going to ask a question, about what I was talking about. But instead, he says, can I go get some ice? I think I hurt my wrist. And sure enough, he had a little bump on his wrist. So one of my youth sponsors took him out and got him all fixed up. And when she brought him back in, she told me, I think he might actually have a fracture. So as the good youth pastor I am, we stopped youth group and we brought him down up front, and I gathered the entire youth group around him, and I said, we're going to pray for this boy, right? And we prayed for him that God would heal him, that there would be no fracture, and that he would just be restored. He came to youth the following week with a cast on his wrist. Indeed, he said, I went to the doctor and it was fractured. I realized in reflecting on this moment, and I want you to understand how I'm saying this, because I'm not saying that prayer is pointless. I hope that you will understand what I'm saying here. But as I reflected on this moment, I realized that praying for him like that right then was almost a lose-lose proposition. Here's why. We pray for him for healing, and then he comes back the next week with a cast. God didn't heal him. That gives confirmation to every doubt that every one of those teenagers had, even as they were praying for him, right? You guys know the feeling. You're praying for someone for healing. You're wondering if God will heal them. Not if he can. We all believe he can, but we're wondering if he will. That's doubt. Will he heal them? I don't know. And then he comes back next week and he's got the cast. God didn't heal him. It just gives me another reason, another piece of evidence to doubt. But suppose he shows up the following week and he has no cast. Do you think that the gut reaction of all of my students is going to be, hey, praise the Lord, look at that, we prayed for him and God healed him? Or do you think, what would your reaction be? Most likely, do you think those teenagers would look at him and say, oh, I guess you didn't break your wrist after all? There was no x-ray done in youth group. Nicole's pretty good at diagnosing these things, but it wasn't a professional medical opinion after a thorough examination. She was bandaging him up and said, I think it might be fractured. And so if he shows up the following week and there's no fracture, most of us, our gut level reaction is going to be, I guess there was no fracture at all. God could have healed this boy and performed a miracle in our service, and there still would have been doubt present in our group. How about this as an example? How we treat the Bible. In a disenchanted world, devoid of transcendence, the Bible would be treated just like any other book. It would be a book in which we would study it. We would try and discover the background information, the context, the languages, all of these kinds of things, the cultural situation, the socioeconomic situation of the audience, the original audience, the author, all of these kinds of things in order to discover what the meaning was. And many of us would be content walking away after listening to a lecture on the background of this passage and feeling like you just got an encounter with God or an experience that you were intended to have. Or do we run to the Bible first as a book to be obeyed and believed, even before we can explain and understand all of it? How many of us have had God speak to us and ask us to do something, and we check with our bank account for permission before we do it? This is life in a disenchanted world. If we truly believe that God owned everything and he is the provider and he commanded us as King of Kings and Lord of Lords to do this, who else do we need to ask for permission? Why would we even check our bank accounts? Because he's capable of doing whatever he wants to do. Miroslav Volf, in his book Flourishing, writes this about our modern age: the greatest of all temptations is not to serve false gods, as monotheists like to think. The greatest of all temptations, equally hard to resist in abundance and in want, is to believe and act as if human beings lived by bread alone, as if their entire lives should revolve around the creation, improvement, and distribution of worldly goods. Serving false gods, or turning the one true God into a mere bread provider, which amounts to the same thing, is the consequence of succumbing to this great temptation. Are we tempted nowadays to turn our religion into a vehicle for our own personal material gain? Wolf says the great trend that we will see in churches that have bought into this lie, this temptation, is that they will become primarily about prosperity. That God's only goal and purpose for us is that we would have and have in abundance material possessions. That just turns God into a great big bread maker for all of us. Now, we all have these blind spots, areas in our lives where our actions betray our disenchantment. Not all of those examples may have felt the same to you, but I hope that I gave you a broad enough range of examples that it at least tweaked something or piqued some area in your heart where you say, yeah, I kind of am like that sometimes. I was going to title this message, How You Will Really Live If You Really Believe That What You Believe Is Really Real. But it didn't look right on the slide. But this conveys what I'm going for this morning. How you will really live if you really believe that what you believe is really real. So how do we live in this secular age? Now, this is perhaps too large a question for a single sermon to address. So let's handle the smaller and more immediate issue at hand. Is there a way through this malaise? I believe that there is, and it is to that solution that we now turn. A way through the malaise. There are several different things that we can do that help enchant our worlds or bring an awareness of transcendence into our lives. The first one that I want to suggest is song. One of the primary methods for poking holes in the roof of our immanent frame and allowing transcendent light to come in is song. Songs unite us to something much larger than ourselves. We can recognize this in the feeling we get during a particularly upset, or even the connection we can feel with thousands of strangers in a concert. I'm not only suggesting spiritual worship music. I'm talking all song. People can feel united to each other through song, united to something higher, to something that is above and beyond themselves. We call that the transcendent. Another way that we can begin to make it through the malaise of modernity is through storytelling. Few things have the ability to instantly transport us out of our own little world and connect us to something much larger, like a good story. Now, Pastor Brooks is going to have more to say about this next month, but the people of God have always been storytellers. And this becomes an important element for us when we look at the way we craft our modern services. We build them around song and storytelling. We do this on purpose because it is through these elements that you truly are able to gain access to the transcendent realm, to see God in a real sense. But a third way through, and the way that I would like to focus in on for the remainder of this message, is something that many of us have probably never considered before, and that is receiving life as a gift. Knowing God occurs in the context of a relationship with Him. But one of the more difficult things to remember in a disenchanted, cross-pressured, fragilized world is that God is a personal being, not just a concept and not just an inanimate being, but an actual personal being. As a youth pastor, I get various questions that, make you have to really stop and think. If you can explain something to a teenager, then you probably really have it down in your head, right? And sometimes they ask some questions that you're like, I'm not sure how I'm supposed to answer that. So then I tell them to go ask their parents. But I begin to notice a trend coming out of the teenagers in our youth group. I would talk about concepts that I thought were very straightforward and very easily accessible. I talk frequently about relationship with God, listening for the voice of God, being obedient to God's call in your life. But the questions I started to get revolved around these kinds of issues. Well, what do you mean relationship? See, if God is a concept or if God's an inanimate being, then we don't mean relationship in the same way that we do if we're talking interpersonal, right? I may have a relationship with my phone, but I don't have a relationship with it in the same way that I have a relationship with my wife. Add to that the fact that technology is making the definition of relationship itself difficult to pin down right now. And these teenagers and young people are having a very difficult time understanding what in the world we're talking about when we say you need to have a relationship with God. What do you mean listen to Him? What do you mean obey His voice or His call in our lives? It's a very difficult thing in this world in which we live to remember that He is a personal being. But one of the more direct routes to remembering and interacting with God as a personal being is to receive this life, really the whole of the cosmos, as a gift from God. Mike Cosper writes, "When I give you a gift, I'm not just giving you a gift, I'm giving you something of myself. The silly gifts our kids give us when they're young mean the world to us because we know it's not the thing itself that matters, but the affirmation that you matter to the child, that the bond between us is intact and secure." I have a picture hanging on my fridge that is a piece of what I can only call modern art. It's a handful of scribbles in crayon on a piece of paper. It would be worth nothing if you tried to sell it in a trinket shop or at a museum. And yet when I walked through the door of my home and my daughter runs up to me with this in her hands and says, "Daddy, I made this for you," it became a priceless piece of art. Not because of the art itself, but because of the relationship behind the gift. At the same time, Cosper goes on to say, receiving a gift involves valuing the gift itself. Honoring the gift is an important part of honoring the giver. We believe that God made everything that has been made. Colossians chapter 1 and verse 16 tells us, "For everything was created by him in heaven and on earth, the visible and the invisible. Whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him." This passage not only tells us that God made everything, it also reveals to us a key to seeing God in a disenchanted age. In verse 15, it tells us that Jesus is the image of the invisible God. So the embodied Jesus is the reminder of the personhood of God. In verse 19 also indicates that God's gift giving didn't end with the incarnation, but that was a step in his grand plan of redemption. Turn to Ephesians in chapter 2 and verse 8. And Paul tells us, "For you are saved by grace through faith, and this is not from yourselves, it is a gift of God." Our salvation is a gift from God. But God didn't stop with creating everything as a gift, offering himself through the incarnation, offering his very presence as a gift, and not even offering salvation or redemption to us as a gift. But he's going to go on to restore all things. We talked about it this morning. Romans chapter 8, verses 19 through 21 say, "For creation eagerly waits with anticipation for God's sons to be revealed. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in the hope that the creation itself will also be set free from the bondage to decay into the glorious freedom of God's children." All of creation joins with us in longing for the restoration of all things. We read during the prayer time, Revelation chapter 21, verses 1 through 7. It speaks of the new creation, the restoration of God's perfect created order. When we step back from the minutia of our daily lives, we're struck with the sheer generosity of our God. James chapter 1 and verse 17 tells us, "Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, who does not change like shifting shadows." Numerous scriptures talk about how generous God is in dealing with us. And so if we come to see the cosmos as God's gift to us, we discover an interesting feature of our relationship with it. I love the way Miroslav Volf puts this in his book, Flourishing. To put it in theological language, we enjoy things most when we experience them as sacraments, as carriers of the presence of another. Now, think of the world as a gift. We have a giver, God, a recipient, you, and a gift, the world. A gift is not the object given as such. Little trinkets on the shelves of gift stores are not gifts. They become gifts when somebody gives them to somebody else. In other words, gifts are relations. If the world is a gift, then all things to which you relate, and many to which you do not, are God's relation to you. He goes on to say that the most important thing about us isn't that God created us. God created bacteria as well. It is that God created us for relationship with God. God isn't an add-on to our already completed being. It's why your neighbor feels haunted. Because there's something in their lives that was created for relationship with God, and until God and that person's heart become united, they will always be restless. As St. Augustine said, we are restless until our hearts find rest in you. God created us for relationship with him, and his gifts to us are one of the primary mechanisms through which his presence becomes tangible. If God's gifts are an important component in experiencing relationship with God, then our response to his gifts reveals the character of our relationship with God. So, as my teenagers will tell you, I ask this question all the time: what is the appropriate response? I suggest that the appropriate response is a life of gratitude and generosity. In 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 6 through 15, Paul writes this to the Corinthian church. The point is this: the person who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and the person who sows generously will also reap generously. Each person should do as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or out of compulsion, since God loves a cheerful giver. And God is able to make every grace overflow to you, so that in every way, always having everything you need, you may excel in every good work. As it is written, he distributed freely, he gave to the poor, his righteousness endures forever. Now the one who provides seed for the sower and bread for food will also provide and multiply your seed and increase the harvest of your righteousness. You will be enriched in every way for all generosity, which produces thanksgiving to God through us. For the ministry of this service is not only supplying the needs of the saints, think immanence versus transcendence here. It's not only supplying the needs of the saints, but it is also overflowing in many expressions of thanks to God. Because of the proof provided by this ministry, they will glorify God for your obedient confession of the gospel of Christ and for your generosity in sharing with them and with everyone. And as they pray on your behalf, they will have deep affection for you because of the surpassing grace of God in you. Thanks be to God for his indescribable gift. Paul suggests here that as a direct result of viewing their lives as gifts from God, the Corinthians ought to pay it forward through extreme generosity. Generosity that comes from a proper understanding of what God has done for us will always point to God, not to myself. God is glorified when I act generously with others because he is shown to be the provider of all that I have. Peter and John said, I don't have any money to give you, but that doesn't mean I don't have anything to give you. Here, let me offer you Jesus. Mike Cosper mentions again in his book, we can only hold loosely what we know was not ours to begin with. In an abundant world, all we have is a gift, and a gift inspires joy and generosity. Our lives are not about what we consume, but what we've been given, and thus what we can share. Over and over in the Bible and in the stories of fellow believers, generosity results in blessing, while hoarding and stinginess invites trouble. Think of the Israelites in the wilderness as God provided them literally with their daily bread. But if they gathered more than what they needed for the day, it would turn to rot in their tents. They needed to trust him daily for his provision. And if they had only held loosely what was not theirs to begin with, then he would provide abundantly again and again. Our God is a generous God. And in reciprocating his generosity, we become more like him. Gratitude opens us up to the giver. So if generosity makes us like the giver and points to the giver, gratitude opens us up to the giver. When we appreciate what we have, it necessarily causes us to acknowledge God as the gift giver. This breaks through our immanent ceiling and allows us to encounter the transcendent. God is honored when his gifts to us are received graciously. And I love this quote, again from Miroslav Volf. He says, attachment to God amplifies and deepens enjoyment of the world. The more we're attached to God, the more we're able to enjoy God in this world. Here then is the beautiful cycle of gratitude. The more we enjoy the world, the more we appreciate God for his gift. The more we appreciate God, the more we enjoy his world. Isn't that a beautiful cycle? The more we honor God by being both gracious and generous, the more we open ourselves up to relationship with him. So what then is the point of this? What do I want you to leave here thinking and feeling, but most importantly, doing? Guys, I recognize that life in a secular age is difficult. Faith in a secular age is even harder. Unable to completely escape doubt, we must find ways to open ourselves up to transcendence, where we can recognize the voice of God when we hear it. I think of Samuel lying on his bed. God calls to him, Samuel, and he runs to Eli. Yes, Eli. Eli says, I didn't call you. Go back to bed. God calls him again. Samuel runs to Eli. Eli sends him back to bed. God calls him again. Samuel runs to Eli. Eli finally realizes what's going on. And he says, Samuel, the next time you hear that voice, that's God. The more we enable ourselves to be open to the transcendent and to recognize the transcendent in our lives, then the easier it will become to recognize the voice of God. Often we're unaware of our blind spots, the areas we don't realize in which we are fully immanentized. But our God is a generous gift giver, and when he gives us gifts, he's giving us something of himself. Being generous shows that we truly know him and we trust his provision. Since he is also generous, our generosity is a reflection of him. We're becoming like him. And in addition to generosity, gratitude is the second proper response to the gifts of God. Paul reminds Timothy in 1 Timothy 6, verses 6 and 7, that when you add contentment to our godly lives, we gain much. Gratitude and contentment are virtues precisely because God is the creator and sustainer of all life. Hillsong has a song called So Will I, and I love one of the lines in that song. As you speak, 100 billion creatures catch your breath. In a very real sense, all of us are dependent on the breath of God for our very next breath. And he generously gives. A right understanding of and response to who God is forms the foundation for relationship with him. So as you leave today, I want you to practice gratitude and generosity. And I want you to remember that in so doing, you actually encounter the person of God.